Some people love old houses, and other people would much rather live in a newly built house. A lot of folks, when they move to our area, they choose a place like Malta or Clifton Park, where they know that all the houses will be new, where there'll be cul-de-sacs and lots of amenities nearby. I have a friend from Vancouver, and I one time got to go home to see where he grew up. He grew up in a condominium on the 20th floor of a glass condo tower downtown. When he wanted to go outside to play, he had to take the elevator. And that's cool, but for me anyway, I would much rather an old house in an old city, like Glens Falls. I like that every block tells a story. I love that when I'm driving on Route 4, I know that this is the way the stagecoaches used to go. This is the path that the Sisters of St. Joseph took by horse and carriage to come from Troy to start our school. I love that kind of thing. I love that this church wouldn't have been here if it weren't for the Great Fire of 1864 that leveled the whole city, except for the rectory. It was one of the only buildings that survived. And it was that allowed this real estate to be available so that we could move here and have this place to worship for almost 160 years of our life. I recently was getting a tour of someone's old house, and it was one of those just beautiful Victorian homes. And as I was going through, I was wondering how old everything was, and the tour blew me away because the owner said, well, this back part here was all sinking. I had to jack this up, and I had to rebuild the whole foundation. And this room here, it's not original. There was an old porch on the north side that got no sun, so I ripped that off, and I used the wood to build this addition. I marveled at these beautiful leaded glass windows. I said, oh my gosh, look at the care they used to put into these windows in houses. He said, well, actually, those are from the old Methodist church they were going to tear down. And I got them, and I put them in this house because I didn't want them to be lost. He told me that while they were doing all that, they had to sleep on cots and use an outhouse for a year. They had no walls in their house. They were all tarps. Now, I don't think we can blame someone who would rather just move into a newly built house. I think we can understand that. A lot of people would much prefer to just have a house that was built by a builder, that's on a cul-de-sac, and is predictable in every way. But if we do have a house like that, we have to admit it's not the same thing as living in a house where we put our own blood, sweat, and tears into it. It's not right or wrong. It's just different. And I think that we know that too when we go on a tour of someone's house. If someone takes us on a tour of their brand new house, we marvel at all the features and amenities. If someone takes us on a tour of their fixer-upper, we're amazed at them. How did you do this? Where did you get the vision for this? How did you not throw in the towel? When it's your blood, sweat, and tears, it's a whole nother level of commitment. In the first reading, we're getting a glimpse of what religion was like before Jesus. Some things haven't changed. Religion has always involved sacrifice. Sacrifice has always been a part of it. But in the times we're hearing about, it was the sacrifice of bulls or lambs or rams sometimes. They would take the blood of the sacrificed animal and they'd sprinkle it on the altar to make it holy, and they'd sprinkle it on the people to make them holy, to show that there was blood involved in what they were doing. Even little kids have this sense. You might have memories of growing up and being blood brothers or blood sisters with somebody. You know, you're hanging out in your fort and you have a little pact you make one day and you prick your finger and you mingle the blood. There's something in us that knows that if blood is involved, it's important. It's high level. And that's what we're celebrating when we think about the Passover being taken by Jesus and transformed into something else. He put his own skin in the game, and he put his own blood on the line. When I first read this gospel, as a preacher, I thought, geez, what am I going to do with this? It sounded to me anyway a little bit boring. It doesn't have any action in it. It's like a bunch of people trying to plan a holiday meal together. You know, like, hey, what do you think we should do for the 4th of July? Do you want to do potato salad? Should we go to the pavilion? I mean, it's a little bit boring in a way. How do you want to celebrate Passover, Jesus? He goes, well, let's go downtown this year, and there's an upper room. And in a way, I thought, what's the point here? But it's interesting for us to remember that Passover was always based on blood. It was the blood of a lamb on the doorpost. But Jesus says in this passage, from now on, it's not going to be a lamb that I'm going to send to do this. It's going to be me. I'm going to use my own blood to make this holy. When it's my blood or your blood that's involved in something, it changes everything. Just like a fixer-upper. If it's our sweat that went into building it, it means something different. When we look at the children that we put our tears into raising, we look at them differently than other people's children. So that's when it's interesting for us to recognize that all of us are coming to something that involved the giving of blood, the shedding of blood for our sake. It makes it interesting that for a lot of us, we have to keep that in mind when we find Mass getting boring for us. You've had that conversation with people. Maybe you've even heard it coming out of your own mouth. It's a very natural criticism of Mass. Sometimes people will say, Father, I would go to Mass, but it's the same thing every week. It just feels so repetitive. I don't want to call it boring. They're trying to be respectful, of course. They're like, I don't want to say boring, Father, but you know what I mean. It's the same thing every week. And that's true on a basic level. But Jesus is not giving us some religious ritual to just go through the same motions of every week. He's literally giving us his blood each time we come. There's nothing boring about what he's doing here. It's repetitive in the sense that saying I love you to your children is repetitive. It's important. It's life-giving. It's why we live. So although we may feel, I just don't know if I'm always getting everything out of it, maybe the question for us is, what am I bringing to it? We know that he's bringing his blood and his sweat and his tears. What are we bringing? I used to have a barber named Jordan, who was a young man in his 20s, very, very popular. There was a long line in his barbershop always. And one week I went to get a haircut, and there was a hastily scribbled sign on the door that said, closed due to an emergency. It was like that for 2 weeks. So when it finally opened, I had to wait a while to get in there. But when I got in, I said, what happened, Jordan? And he said, it was the craziest thing. He goes, my lung collapsed. I couldn't breathe. And I spent a whole week in the hospital. I've always been healthy. I don't know what happened. And then he told me that halfway through the week he was in the hospital, his wife came in with a package from his 5-year-old stepdaughter. She was worried about him. And when he opened the package, he said he burst into tears because what was in there was her favorite stuffed animal. The one that she can't sleep without. The one that there's been so many tears and tantrums over. That stuffed animal was in the bag so that he could sleep with it. And he knew that she was going to have terrible nights until she got it back. That it was the most precious thing in her life. But she wanted him to have it. That wasn't a token that she gave him. It wasn't some little gesture of, get well soon. It was her blood, sweat, and tears. And hearing a story like that gives us a sense, a glimpse of what's happening in the Eucharist. So the question is, what are we bringing when we come? What's our precious thing, our stuffed animal that we can't live without. Jesus is bringing his blood. Are we bringing tears? Are we bringing our sweat? Are we willing to do things? There's volunteers that are working so hard in the Great Hall all day on one of the most beautiful Sundays of summer. Are we involved in the food pantry, or are we volunteering somehow in the school? Is there some sort of community service that's connected to our faith and what we're doing here? The beautiful thing about what Jesus did at the Last Supper is he wasn't going to send a bull or a lamb to do his job for him. He was going to do it himself. He put his blood and sweat and tears into us. One way to look at it is, we're all fixer-uppers. Each one of us is a fixer-upper. And Jesus fell in love with us and had to have us. And so now he's renovating us, you and me, one room at a time.